Life is not the same as consciousness. It's a harder problem in many ways. But just because something seems mysterious now, with the tools and concepts we have now, doesn't mean that an extension of that approach won't be up to the job. The hard problem of consciousness, I think, could very well be dissolved, even if it's not solved.
So this talk is about consciousness within and beyond the brain. And our panel includes Anil Seth, who's a professor of neuroscience at the University of Sussex, Philip Goff, who's a professor of philosophy at Durham, and John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive psychologist at the University of Toronto. So I'm hoping that you'll also give some idea of the perspective of your disciplines in the approach to consciousness, so that we get a bit of an idea where how different disciplines look at the issue of consciousness. So I'm going to start by asking each of them a few questions to lay out their position and their thoughts on consciousness. And then ultimately, I want everybody else to be asking them questions as well, so that, I'm sure people have a lot of questions that they want to ask, so that we get a bit interactive at this point. But to start with, Anil, shall we start with you? I mean, can you lay out for us how you see consciousness and what your approach is? And also, additionally, maybe you could also add how that compares to what some of your colleagues think about your thoughts, like whether you're mainstream or... Yeah.
Sure, I've got 90 minutes, right, to do this. No, I'll do it very, very quickly. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So it was great to hear. I think it was Ian started with the quote from Stuart Sutherland, right, didn't she? That consciousness is elusive. Nothing worth reading has been written on it, which is remarkably disenchanting to read when I read it as a starting undergraduate in the early 1990s. Like, come on. But things have changed. Around the same time, Daniel Dennett wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. Another title of great humility, by the way. Dennett sadly recently passed away, became a friend and a mentor later on. And reading his book when I was studying as an undergrad made me think, no, there is a there. There's something sensible as a scientist that one can do to speak to this grand mystery of consciousness. And Dennett is broadly considered as one of the sort of materialist philosophers, that consciousness can be explained in terms of things happening in brains and in bodies. And broadly speaking, that is the view I take. I guess I'm here representing mainstream neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience in some form, though, as I'll say in a second. There are many differences within this broad remit, and my colleagues vigorously disagree with me about some of these things. But broadly, so I think I take the view of a pragmatic materialist. So we have brains. Matter is very complicated, as has been pointed out twice already. We don't really know what matter is. But let's take as a working assumption there are brains, they're made of stuff, and they're very complicated. They perhaps have emergent properties, but not magical properties. And consciousness also exists. There's other schools of philosophy that say, we're even mistaken that there's a mystery about consciousness. There's only physical interactions and functional dispositions. Illusionism, often this is called. Philip has a great podcast with called something. I've forgotten what it's called.
Mind Chat.
Mind Chat with a leading illusionist, where they banter. It's great. But I'm happy to accept. We have conscious experiences. In a sense, it's the only thing we can be sure of. We're conscious. We're having experiences. And as a working assumption, there are also these things called brains and bodies. We know the two are intimately connected. When you have general anesthesia, consciousness is lost. Much more so than when you go to sleep. General anesthesia is the total absence. How many people have had general anesthesia? The rest of you do it. I highly recommend it. It's a great existential insight into what consciousness is. It's different from sleep. You are gone completely, and then it comes back. So that's my working definition. How do we explain that difference? And when we're conscious of something, we're conscious of sight, sound, smells, objects, people, places, emotions, thoughts, beliefs, the contents of consciousness. Level, what goes away in anesthesia, content, what we're conscious of, and self, the specific experience of being me or being you, as my book is called. These are the explanatory targets for me of consciousness research. And rather than trying to solve the problem head on, this so-called hard problem of consciousness, it's been alluded to, I don't know if it's been stated explicitly. David Chalmers, a very prominent philosopher of mind, puts it like this. He says something like, we know consciousness is intimately related to the brain, but how and why physical processing should be associated with or give rise to consciousness at all, we don't know. It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. That's a caricature of the hard problem. It's a very hard problem because it doesn't even seem like there could be a reasonable answer we could give in terms of neurons interacting or chemicals flowing around or anything. And it may be true. It may be that some other philosophical position is required, like panpsychism. It may be true that we need a new kind of physics or something like that. But I think we have a lot more we can do with the resources of materialist explanations. That's why it's pragmatic materialism. Let's see how far we can get. We've been enormously successful in other areas of science. Other things that have seemed mysterious, like life. How do we explain the difference between the living and the non-living? Vitalists thought physics, chemistry was not up to the job. They were wrong. The hard problem of life wasn't solved by finding the spark of life or proving that it doesn't exist, but by dissolving the hard problem of life. We gradually explain its properties, and we don't know everything about life, but it no longer has this patina of deep mystery about it. Life is not the same as consciousness. It's a harder problem in many ways. But just because something seems mysterious now, with the tools and concepts we have now, doesn't mean that an extension of that approach won't be up to the job. The hard problem of consciousness, I think, could very well be dissolved, even if it's not solved. So as a neuroscientist, and I'll finish in a sec, the take I have on this is to try and use all the tools we have from mathematics, physics, neuroscience, complexity theory, machine learning, to not just establish brute correlations between what's happening in the brain and in the conscious mind. Because a correlation is not an explanation. Like the rate of cheese production in Wisconsin correlates with the divorce rate, I think, in Florida, something like that. Of course, it doesn't explain anything, right? You need to go beyond beyond correlation towards explanation. And the more you do that, the more you can say, okay, the reason this kind of brain activity goes along with consciousness is because I can see there's a mapping between that aspect of the brain and that aspect of consciousness. You have explanatory grip, you have predictive power, and you're able to control, intervene. And that's what science typically does. Explains, controls, predicts. Doesn't mean you have to explain why the thing is part of the universe in the first place, although that would be nice too. And in my work, there are lots of tools for this. There are tools of things like measures of complexity and emergence. It's not that they're magic, no, but they give us a way of understanding how a whole can be more than the sum of the parts in a rich, powerful, but non-mysterious way that could have something to do with how consciousness seems to be a unified experience that is greater than the sum of its parts. The other core concept I use is the brain as a prediction machine. That what we experience is not a transparent reflection of objective reality. This came up before. We don't see things as they are. As Anil Seth said, we see things as we are. Our brain constructs our conscious experiences of the world and the self. And as a rich body of work, giving explicit mechanisms for how the brain might make predictions, calibrate these predictions using sensory data that can actually explain why vision is different from touch, is different from emotion, is different from an experience of free will, and all of these things. And by following these roads, I think we do chip away at the hard problem of consciousness. And things get bit by bit less mysterious. Eventually, the hard problem may disappear in a puff of metaphysical smoke, but it may not. A residue of mystery might remain. This might be because we ourselves are conscious, so we have an implicitly higher bar for what counts as an intuitive explanation. Or it might be that, science just isn't up to the job. But the path of this pragmatic materialism, nonetheless, is helping us already understand consciousness in different ways. Like, what does happen when we go under anesthesia? Why do we have hallucinations sometimes and not at other times? How does emotion relate to the self, and so on? And so even if there is still some residue of mystery, the questions we ask about consciousness change. And I think that's as much a sign of progress in the field as how much our answers develop. If the questions change, then that also can reflect a deeper understanding of this mystery that for each of us is really the mystery that matters more than anything.
Can I just ask quickly, so you're doing experiments in the lab on consciousness. Could you give an example of something you might be doing to measure some aspect of consciousness?
Yeah, so just to ground this in the day-to-day. So for instance, we might look exactly at what happens when somebody goes under general anesthesia or into a dreamless sleep. We'll put them in brain imaging scanners and we'll get data, and we'll try and sort of understand, okay, what is happening in the brain when consciousness is lost. But again, in a way that may say, okay, consciousness has a unity. Is there a sort of mathematical property of globality or unity that we can track in the dynamics of the brain? So building these connections. The other main things we do are along the lines of predictive processing. So for instance, we use machine learning algorithms adapted and run in various novel ways to generate simulated altered experiences, like simulated hallucinations of various kinds, like when people are on psychedelics or in Parkinson's disease or other forms. So we can simulate altered conscious experiences through a model of what the brain is doing when it's generating perceptual experiences. And then we can go to people with these different kinds of hallucinations and calibrate our models against their lived experience and sort of iterate like that. And that gives us a sense of what's happening in the brain when a person is having a conscious perception of the scene around them.
Great. Okay, and one final question, just to, I'm a beginner to all this, so just to lay the groundwork. I mean, in your book, there's sort of a definition of consciousness of it feels like something to be me. And if that's the definition, then I find it hard, how can it apply to non-humans or objects, or, how... Is that just a different definition of consciousness, or how
so that definition, it's slightly different, and it comes from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. And for me, it's a sort of good starting point because it's maximally simple. Nagel says, and I hope I get this right, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. That's what he says. So it's not a human-only definition. It's just emphasizing that for a thing, an organism that is conscious, it feels like something to be that thing. It feels like something to be me, to be you, perhaps to be an octopus, maybe to be a fruit fly. But a table, even a panpsychist would probably say, it doesn't feel like anything to be the table, qua table, right? There is no interiority. So that's another way of saying it. So it's a very general definition. I like it because it just emphasizes really consciousness is, in this case, when you strip away everything else, all our human connotations of language, of intelligence, of explicit self-reflection. If experiencing is going on, consciousness is there. If it isn't, it isn't. So it's a very simple starting point.
Okay, Philip, do you want to lay out your stall?
Yeah. So, right, firstly, what I am most passionate about, more than panpsychism, what I'm most passionate about is to emphasize this is not just a scientific problem. What we have at the core of this is the ancient philosophical challenge known as the mind-body problem, right? The challenge of explaining how consciousness and the physical world connect together. And I think the reason we have that problem as human beings is that we access reality in two radically different ways. We access the physical world with our senses. When we get a bit better at that, we do science. But we can't access directly consciousness in that way. Consciousness isn't something we discovered in a particle collider or looking down a microscope. We know about consciousness in a very different way, not from experiments, just by the immediate awareness each of us has of our own conscious experience. If you're in pain, you're just directly aware of the pain. So there are these two seemingly very different things that we know about in very different ways, and then we have to think, how do they fit together? And there are a few options. Maybe the physical world that we know about with our senses is fundamental, and consciousness comes out of physical processes in the brain. This is known as physicalism or materialism, the view Anil prefers. Another option is maybe it's the other way around. Maybe consciousness, the thing we know immediately, is the fundamental thing, and physical reality emerges from some more fundamental story about consciousness. Panpsychism, the view I prefer, goes for something like that. A third option is maybe they're both fundamental but radically different. This is maybe consciousness is in the soul, that's outside of the body and the brain. This is dualism, that's probably the most popular theory in human history. Now, here's a crucial point. Each of these views, at least in certain forms, is observationally equivalent, which means you can't do an experiment to find out which is correct, right? You've just got to take them as philosophical possibilities and try and evaluate them. I'll say a little bit more about how you might try and do that in a second. So this is important to me because I think the reason physicalism is still the most popular option, it's not that anti-physicalism is a huge minority, but it's 52%, 32%, and the others can't make the mark. So it's not quite Brexit, but it's... but I think it's because people think physicalism is the sciencey option. And I just think that's false. I think all the scientific data, at least as we currently have it, is just neutral on all of these options. I read Anil's book. I absolutely love the science he's done. I think it's nothing to do with the mind-body problem. I think you can be a physicalist like he is, and accept all his views on the brain as a prediction machine and so on, or a panpsychist or a dualist. It's just these, we just got to distinguish the scientific and the philosophical task. Okay, so the view I myself prefer, and maybe I'll just say a little bit about what it is and then why I think we should take it seriously. So panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of reality, that the basic entities may be fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of experience, and then the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these simpler forms of consciousness. Crucially, a panpsychist needn't think literally everything is conscious, despite the etymology of the word pan, everything, psyche, mind. The basic commitment is that the fundamental entities are conscious. So a panpsychist probably won't think, this phone is conscious, but they might very well think that the smallest things it's made up of have some kind of rudimentary experience. Secondly, another common misunderstanding, we're not saying electrons have the consciousness like a human being has. Human consciousness is very complicated, the result of millions of years of evolution. But as we'll probably discover later this afternoon, consciousness comes in many shapes and sizes. Consciousness of a mouse is maybe simpler to that of a human. Consciousness of a snail or a bedbug, simpler still. And as we move to simpler forms of life, we find simpler forms of consciousness. For a panpsychist, this keeps going down right to the bottom, where we find incredibly simple forms of experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature. Okay, so maybe finally, why should we take this view seriously? Well, as I say, I don't think we can distinguish these philosophical options by an experiment. One thing we can do is think about their explanatory aspirations and how well have they done. The physicalist aims to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes in the brain. So how well has that gone? The panpsychist aims to do it the other way around, explain physical reality in terms of fundamental consciousness. How well has that gone? Well, with the physicalist explanatory project, it has gone precisely nowhere, right? Despite decades of serious effort and money. Now, that's not to say the science of consciousness. I think the science of consciousness has made great progress by people like Anil. But I don't think it's made on the philosophical view of physicalism explaining, not just that we don't have the final story, we haven't managed to explain how a single experience might arise from underlying brain activity. So you might say, like Anil, I suppose, well, just give it time, it's early days. I mean, I think ultimately, and this is a big debate, but ultimately I think it's an incoherent project. So what the physicalist needs to give is a reductive explanation of consciousness. When I say reductive explanation, I mean when you explain one phenomenon in terms of another. You explain lightning in terms of electric discharge. Physicalist wants to explain feelings and experiences in terms of electrochemical signaling. But if you look at what reductive explanation looks like in physical science, it's all about behavior. It's all about explaining complex behavior in terms of simpler behavior. If you think about, explaining the liquidity of water in terms of underlying chemistry, you explain, the behavior of a body of water in terms of the more basic behavior of molecules and atoms. That's what physical science since the scientific revolution is really good at, explaining publicly observable behavior. But that is just not what you're trying to do when you're explaining consciousness. You're not trying to explain some behavior. You're trying to explain why some things have feelings. It's just a different expansion project. So I think it's a little bit like saying telescopes have been really good in astronomy. Maybe they'll be really good in pure mathematics. It's just a totally different explanatory project. Okay, so that's physicalism. I think it's gone nowhere. It's arguably incoherent. Contrast that with the explanatory project of panpsychism, nearly finished. And I would say there, we've sort of worked out how it's done. The mysteries have been solved. And talking about, we've had some arrogant titles of books today. There's just an arrogant statement. But, I'm not claiming this for myself. This is where the contemporary philosophical panpsychist research program draws on the inspiration of really important work by Bertrand Russell in the 1920s. I think of Russell as the Darwin of consciousness. I think he solved the mysteries. Also, Arthur Eddington developed this following Russell, who was one of the first scientists to experimentally confirm Einstein's general theory of relativity. So their essential insight was that physics, and I'll just finish on this, was that physics is purely mathematical. And that's very useful, but what that shows is physics doesn't really care what's going on at the fundamental level of reality. All it cares about is that, whatever's going on down there, it has the right mathematical structure. So the panpsychist postulates very simple conscious entities interacting at the fundamental level. As long as those entities interact in a way that gets the right patterns, the right mathematical structures, you will get physics out of that. That just follows from the fact that physics is just purely mathematical. So we can't get consciousness out of physics, but we can get physics out of consciousness. Thanks to Russell, we just know how to do that, how to make sense of that. So I like to put it at the final page of Brief History of Time. Hawking famously says, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. So for the panpsychist, it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So in summary, two research programs, sort of mirror image of each other. One, never got anywhere, arguably incoherent. Second, has delivered the goods. Mysteries are all solved. And I think the only reason we're still trying to cling to the first one is scientism, in this sense that physicalism, false sense that physicalism is sort of the sciencey option and people really don't really know what philosophy is. So anyway, that's what I think about these.
Can I just ask one follow-up question, which is, when you're talking about consciousness and Anil's talking about consciousness and when Ian's talking about consciousness, are you actually talking about the same thing? Because it seems, I don't completely get that sense as a layperson that
I did just know, I don't think, I would say yes, actually. I think I was quite happy with Anil giving Thomas Nagel's definition of consciousness as just experience, something's conscious when it's something that's like to be it. I actually think Anil referred to Daniel Dennett as a mentor, and Dennett was a great, wonderful philosopher, and I had some great interactions with him. I think in a sense, Anil is closer to me than Dennett in a sense, because I think there's a very important sense in which Dennett denied the existence of consciousness. You have to be careful about it. He thinks the only sense in which there's consciousness is something that can be defined behaviorally. Not just behavior of the organism, but behavior of the parts of the organism. That's the only sense in which he believes in consciousness. Whereas I think what Anil and I would both think, what is the more dominant view, that's a somewhat radical physicalist position, is that at least at the starting point of conceptual, what we mean, we don't define consciousness in terms of behavior. Like when I say, my partner's in pain, I'm not making a claim about her behavior or the behavior of her parts. I'm claiming about how she feels, and that's a very different kind of claim. Of course, where you go from there, we get to very different points. But I would say, actually, at least on the starting point, I would say we do have the same understanding of what consciousness means.
Okay, John, do you want to introduce us to your thoughts on consciousness and what it is? And
I'm a cognitive psychologist, but I'm also a cognitive scientist. Until very recently, I was the director of the cognitive science program at Toronto. And so I speak from both of those hats. And what cognitive science tries to do is to try and derive insights by integrating philosophy, neuroscience, machine learning, and psychology together. And I'll try to speak from that perspective. So we're looking for more of a synoptic integration across these disciplines. And so I like to focus initially on what I think are the sets of questions that are often implicit, and we might want to pull them apart with respect to consciousness. And then I'll make a claim about what I think the relationship between those questions are, and I think that points to an answer. So the first question is, think of what Ian said. We seem to do so much complex, sophisticated, highly intelligent behavior without consciousness, and so that naturally leads to this kinds of question. What's the function of consciousness? What does it do? And you presumably want some functionality to consciousness if you want to have any kind of evolution of consciousness, because evolution works in terms of the function of things. And so you need some answer. Now, I'll get into the relationship between these questions and how you prioritize them in a second. The second question that Phil is emphasizing is, many people call it different things, the generation problem, the nature problem. I like the nature problem. Is how is it that consciousness, which seems to have these experiential properties to it, exists in a universe that seems, at least initially, panpsychism maybe is correct, but at least initially, lots of these things don't seem to have experiential properties to them. And so how is it that something like consciousness that seems to be made out of, that's not a very good way of putting it, made out of experiential properties exists in a world where things don't seem to be that way? That's the nature problem. Then there's the transcendental problem. Now, that term is, I'm going to try and use that term in a very precise way. We bandy that term about, and we often use it synonymously with transcendent, and it's unfortunate because there's a good distinction that's lost when we do that. Transcendental, I'm using it the way Kant did and the phenomenologists do. When we say something is transcendental, we mean it's a condition that makes our knowing of things possible. So a transcendental condition is what has to be the case in order for me to know something. And so for many people, my friend and colleague Evan Thompson, for example, people coming out of the phenomenological tradition say, there's a problem treating consciousness the way we treat it as if it's just another thing, because it seems to have a transcendental dimension to it. Namely, we need to seem to be conscious in order to be able to know anything, and that's a transcendental issue. So there's also nobody denies there's what are called empirical aspects of consciousness. Consciousness can also be known, it can be observed in some fashion, but it seems to also have this transcendental aspect to it. And then there's sort of a fourth problem that's lurking like a psychopath, which is, what's your fundamental ontology? And this is only more recently coming to the fore. And so there are the sort of two main options that are out there right now around us that are intersecting with discussions of consciousness are, do you think, do you believe in substances? Now, substances sounds like stuff, because that's how we've used the word, but it's really meant in Aristotle's sense. A substance is an independently existing thing. So if you'll allow me to speak a little more loosely, do you think the world's made up of things and that relations emerge from the things? And then there is a relationality ontology that says, no, you think relations are primary, and the relata, the things, emerge out of the relations. Now, all four of these questions, they're not identical. At least I would argue that. So I'm making a meta argument about the arguments. See, I have to say meta at some point, right? And so, although they're not identical, here's where I will now take my stand, and I'll now start to lay my cards on the table. I do not think these questions can be answered independently of each other. I think the attempt to answer any one of these questions involves important assumptions and presuppositions on all the other questions. And very often, people think they're arguing about the nature, and they're also implicitly arguing about function, the transcendental problem, and fundamental ontology issues. For example, if you reject physicalism, it's not just, and I don't mean dismissively, because of Phil's argument, you also, if you're a physicalist, you have a fundamental ontology. You have a substance ontology, I would argue, even though I think physics is moving more properly towards a relational ontology. So, what do I think that implies? I think that that actually puts heavy constraints on the potential contenders for good accounts of consciousness. Our problem is not a dearth of theories of consciousness. You get 4 people talking about consciousness in a room, and you'll have 27 theories. Okay, it's not that we lack a number of theories. And you know, I imagine my colleagues suffer from this. I get email daily about people offering me their theory of consciousness. You know, I wish they would just each send in a nickel with that email, and I could retire. But so, what I'm looking for is what are reasonable constraints that we could put on how we select between them. This is a meta-theoretical argument I'm making. And one of the constraints I'm proposing is we need theories that can give a coherent, integrated answer to all 4 of those questions. And as soon as you start looking at that, many theories get ruled out. Because one of the pervasive things that happens in a lot of the literature is questions will be treated in a very isolated fashion. And this is not meant to be especially critical of one theory. You'll get the global workspace theory, right, of bars. And he'll go on and he'll say, I'm trying to answer the function question, but I'm not addressing the nature question. But of course he is. He is. He's implicit. And he's also, he's by assumption or absence, he's answering the transcendental question. He's also answering the fundamental ontology question, right? So one of the things I've tried to do, which may initially seem counterintuitive, and I've made a career out of pursuing things that originally seemed counterintuitive, and for a long time, like I almost got canned at the university and things like that, but it sort of panned out in the long term, so I'm going to stick with it, which is I recommend looking for other hard problems that will also involve these and see if we can make linkages between them. So Dan Dennett has been mentioned. Dan Dennett also helped to make famous another problem that I have devoted my career to, which is called the relevance problem. And this goes towards Ian's problem of selection. Now give me a minute, I won't talk for too much longer. The relevance problem is this. You have so much information available to you in this room that you could pay attention to. You have so much available information in your long-term memory. You have so many different possible combinations of actions you could perform. You have so many possibilities you could consider. You have so many logical implications you could derive, and you're ignoring most of them. This sounds like a Zen koan. You're intelligent by ignoring astronomically vast amounts of information on a moment-by-moment basis. When you're playing a game of chess, the number of logical possibilities outnumbers the number of atomic particles in the universe. You don't consider them all. This is what fascinates me about you. You somehow don't arbitrarily choose because your chances of finding the answer of all of that is astronomically small. You can't algorithmically search it because it'll take more than the rest of the history of the universe, and yet you're doing it right now. Right now, you're doing it. You're zeroing in on the relevant information. Now here's my proposal, and I can't make an argument for it because I'm out of time. I propose that relevance realization is the fundamental function of consciousness. What it's doing is doing relevance realization. It's a kind of deep selection. And Anil's written some things that line up with this quite well. I teach one of his papers in one of my courses. Maybe he's changed his mind, but you know. I actually think, and this is where Phil and I will get into an argument, but I think it'll be a fruitful one. I think a lot of the phenomenology of consciousness can be explained by relevance realization. Relevance realization is not computational. Just published a paper on that last month. It is not computational. Therefore, it doesn't suffer from all of the issues about how computationalism can't explain consciousness. Relevance realization, I just showed you, is transcendental. You're not doing relevance realization, you're not doing categorization, you're not doing inference, you're not doing perception. It's a transcendental condition, so it satisfies that problem. Relevance realization makes a claim about fundamental ontology. It says relation is prior. Right? Where is the relevance of anything? Is it in the object? No, that wasn't relevant until I tapped it. Is it in me? No, I can't just arbitrarily choose things are relevant. Relevance is neither subjective or objective. It is what binds the two of them together transjectively. It's a fundamentally different orientation towards ontology. And I think it actually maps with how perception works. Perception works in terms of affordances, which are transjective in nature. I think it's mapping on to fundamental physics. Entanglement at the bottom, relativity at the top. These are all relational ontologies. It maps into ancient wisdom traditions. Ian was invoking Neoplatonism and Whitehead. They are both relational ontologies through and through and through. This is just a gesture. I have lots of publications, both text and YouTube videos on this. But I think if we try to answer all four of these problems, and if we take a look at, we need to do that in coordination with other converging hard problems, I think that puts a lot of constraints on what we can consider for our theories of consciousness. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to have one more question that I'll put to the three of them, but if somebody has a burning question, put up your hand, because you want to start, Nigel? Go for it.
It's not burning so hot. Oh, okay.
Why don't you start?
I'd like to just pick up on the question about relevance. It's so interesting, but I didn't see the connection with the experiential element of consciousness.
Sure.
Because it could be complete relevant, it's the spotlight, but you could have the spotlight which is effective functionally without the experience.
Okay, and I want to answer that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so part of what I would say is we fixated on the hard problem. We philosophers and all of us in the biz, we talk about qualia. That's our term for these sort of the subjective feel of things. It comes from the word quality, the original distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Primary are mathematical, secondary are not. And so those are all the qualias. And we focused on things like the greenness of green and the blueness of blue, and that doesn't seem to be what you're talking about. But you see, that's very problematic. First of all, there seems to be experiences in which those kinds of adjectival qualia are completely absent. The pure consciousness event, minimal experience event, things like that. But what's not absent from those experiences, and I've experienced those because I've been a long-term meditator. You don't even experience them, that's not quite the right term. You sort of realize them. But anyways, what's still there, though, are what you might call adverbial qualia. The here-ness, the now-ness, the togetherness of your experience. And you're having that right here, right now. That's as experiential as red and green and blue. The fact that you're here, these give you orientation and indexicality. And they're still present in that pure consciousness event. So they seem to be, those kinds of qualia, the adverbial qualia, seem to be essential to consciousness in a way in which the adjectival qualia are not. Because people do not say that they lose consciousness in the pure consciousness event. They don't black out. They just don't have any conceptual or adjectival content. But they still have the adverbial. Can the adverbial be explained with relevance realization? Of course it is. Here-ness is how things are relevant to you. That's what the word here means. That's why here means something different from you than it does to me. It's a relevance arrow. Nowness does that with time. Togetherness is how do things fit together? How are they relevant together insofar as they're relevant to you? I can explain here-ness, nowness, and togetherness with relevance realization. I can explain valence. Are you moving towards or away from something with relevance realization? And see, these aspects of your experience are absolutely, I think, transcendental. You don't have experience, you don't have consciousness without them. I don't deny the existence of adjectival qualia. And like Anil, I think it may turn out that we may not just have the conceptual categories for explaining them, but I would argue that they're neither necessary nor sufficient for consciousness, and therefore they're not essential. in a very philosophically important way. And therefore, relevance realization can explain what's essentially experiential.
Thank you. Okay, so Anil, can I ask you, what is the thing about your work that people most disagree with?
Well, I think you've heard from some of this panel already.
Complete write-off.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I will resist the temptation to address all of the lovely points I've heard, except just 1 second there.
We love each other.
1 second. Going precisely nowhere, I think, is that's an interesting view. And it's not just give it more time,
Gone
the physicalist project, but give it some time and money. You missed the money bit. We need that too. So what is it that most of my... We've heard there are these very substantive disagreements about what is even the right way to look at the problem. Is it from panpsychism, is it from physicalism, is it from some other ism? There's many more isms to choose from as well. Within this broad project, however, of thinking about trying to explain the properties of consciousness in terms of things happening in brains and bodies, there is still a dominant view, it's been hinted at a little bit, which is that information processing is sufficient. Computation of some kind is sufficient. And this is something that's actually pretty strongly identified with cognitive science as a discipline, right? I mean, this is why cognitive science became prominent and powerful, partially because of the success of the metaphor of the brain as a computer. But it is a metaphor, and we always get into trouble when we start to reify our metaphors and take them not merely seriously, but literally. And if you think the brain literally is a computer, then that does kind of support the idea that, well, if the brain is a computer and consciousness is something that's intimately related to brains, then consciousness is perhaps a kind of computational process, some form of information processing. You hear these words very, very frequently. It's what we'll talk about this more tomorrow. It's what I think drives the idea that AI is on a track to being conscious if it's not already so. I think this is hugely mistaken. So I was very influenced by people like Evan Thompson and more inactive schools of cognitive science, so on. Sussex was sort of very big on thinking about the brain in a non-computational way. Not everything that is physical is computational, right? You can have descriptions of complex systems that interact. You can describe them computationally. We can have a computer simulation of a weather system. That's fine, but weather systems aren't themselves computational. They're molecules of air and water bouncing off each other in various ways. So I actually disagree with this idea that consciousness is a form of information processing or computation. Can't disprove it, but I just think it's a metaphor that's run its course, and it gets us into more trouble than it sheds light at the moment. And the line of, it's not something I set out to support, but it's just the way in which the work that I've been doing over the last 2 decades has evolved, has led me to the view that consciousness is likely to be a property not of computation, but of life. So it is not information processing that breathes fire into the equations of consciousness. It's not consciousness that breathes fire into the equations of physics. It is life that breathes fire into the equations of consciousness. That's what makes us actually feel things, hear things, see things. It's a fundamentally biological property. John Searle, another philosophical reference point, calls this biological naturalism. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think we all too often overlook the essential fact that we are living biological creatures, the kind of meat machines inside our skulls and bodies, and not just implementations of some sophisticated mindware. We are living flesh and blood creatures, and the basic argument is that these predictive mechanisms in the brain that I think underpin all our conscious experiences, the reason they exist, the reason we have them and what they are doing is ultimately grounded in regulation, control of life processes themselves that go right down into individual cells. Living systems are very, very different from non-living systems in all sorts of ways. They produce themselves. A computer does not produce itself. A factory does not produce itself. We are autopoietic in some of these words. So most of my colleagues disagree about that. They think that life is a contingent property. We just happen to be living systems. Consciousness is something that doesn't really depend on us as being alive. It's information process. Whenever someone says information processing in the brain, that's the implicit claim that life doesn't really matter. except insofar as maybe it's necessary to give the right kind of information processing.
Thank you. Charlie.
Thank you all. Is this on? Can you all hear me? Okay. So Simon, John, and Ian, I think, have all invoked Platonism or Neoplatonism as a framework, an ancient Western framework for thinking about consciousness. And I want to press on one point from out of that tradition, which is that from the perspective of the metaphysical picture we broadly label as Platonist, what we're calling consciousness is not something they're primarily interested in or very much impressed by. So Simon mentioned Plotinus and synesthesis, which we translate as consciousness. The phenomenology of consciousness in Plotinus, he gives a phenomenology of consciousness, but largely because he's interested in forms of thinking that transcend consciousness, in a sense that consciousness is a kind of exiled or occluded form of thinking that we inhabit in this condition of embodied and ensouled life, but essentially that there's a higher form of, I don't know if we should call it, how we translate these terms. In Greek, you call it noesis. Mm-hmm. It is the function of the nous, which is a function that is, function is the wrong word, it is a faculty that is thinking eternally and uninterruptedly, whether you are conscious of it or not. You are essentially eternally contemplating the forms, and your consciousness here is, if we, to use the metaphor, is a kind of a very thin aperture of what you might call noesis. So I'm wondering, from the perspective of the definitions of consciousness here, whether, it may be that something like noesis is of no interest to the disciplines that you're in because you're essentially focused on something like consciousness. You may deny the existence of noesis. But because the Platonic framework has been invoked, I wonder if you could speak to the possibility of consciousness as, well, or I don't even know if I should say other forms of consciousness, but essentially forms of thinking from which consciousness might be derived, and whether that's at all relevant for thinking about consciousness here and now.
Well, I'd like to answer that. Great. So yeah, I agree. I just first want to mention there's a symmetry problem. The emergentist has the problem of getting to the whole, but Neoplatonism is the great historical evidence that the emanationist has a symmetrical problem of how do you get any difference emerging from the original one. And so I think those symmetries of problems mean that there's something wrong with both of those absolutizations of either emergence or emanation. I say that because that's relevant to the background of my answer. I think the primary thing that, maybe you don't agree with me on this, Charles, but I think the primary thing that the Neoplatonists are running off of is intelligibility. And I think intelligibility is exactly, and what they were moving towards is that intelligibility can't be understood either from within the knower or from just the object known, but it has to be a mutual participation, or what I would say a transjective. It has to be something that binds them together. So this would be something I would offer you as a position, and then we could argue at length, but I think relevance realization is an attempt to understand intelligibility, how intelligibility is, how it is that the world and the mind can co-participate in shared principles such that they can be coupled together so that intelligibility exists between them in a fundamental way. And I think what I'm proposing is that consciousness, as we understand it, at least, like talking about consciousness, like talking about God, you can't get, like no matter what you say, I disagree with that. But generally people, I'll call it this, what we mean by psychological consciousness, which I think is what Plotinus is kind of pointing towards. I think that that is properly, has to be understood in terms of this more fundamental capacity for relevance realization. The way that, as Plotinus would put it, the way the object known and the knower are mutually fitted to each other and mutually appropriate to each other, how they co-participate in shared fundamental principles. And that requires an ontology in which you prioritize relationality over the things related. I do think, in fact, I've been trying to make it this argument that I agree with Anil. I just published on this. Cognition is not computation, right? I belong to what's called 4E cog sci, that cognition depends on autopoiesis, life. And so I think you have to understand, I've been trying to argue that 4E cog sci is ultimately is a relational ontology, and that it could be grounded very well in a Neoplatonic framework. Now there's a lot of moves in that argument, and I'm just gesturing towards them. But I have been thinking a lot about that question, and I think if you think that what gets the Neoplatonists going is the intuition that there is a non-logical identity between intelligibility and being, and if we can explicate intelligibility, that'll give us access to the depths of being, then I would then run the argument I've just ran.
Could I maybe say something quickly about, or maybe after,
well, sorry.
after the, you go.
One of the things that you mentioned is that we are intelligent by ignoring.
Yes.
And you mentioned the concept of relevance. Can you actually elaborate on consciousness and relevance, how we make relevant decisions, how do we regard what is relevant?
Right. So you don't have a relevance detector, because that would mean you'd be checking everything to see if it was relevant or not, and then you're dead. Right? So that's not how relevance works, right? It's the world and the fully embodied embedded organism co-create relevance together. It's like adaptation. Like a shark is adaptive, but only in the ocean. It's not adaptive in the Sahara Desert. Is that making sense to you? Like when you talk about how does consciousness associated with it, think about if I were to give you a string of letters. Anil talks about this in one of his papers. It's called the chunking phenomenon. If I give you a bunch of letters, and I do this with my students all the time, like 9 letters, and I show them and I go, can you tell me what this is? Look at it, look away. They can't tell me. And then I rearrange the same letters, and they form the words pig, dog, and cat. And I give them even less time to look at it. And then I say, now can you tell me what all the letters are? And they go like that. Well, why? What happened? Same letters. What happened was they're put together in a way that your working memory is looking for. It's looking for how much relevance realization processing has gone into the information. That's the work my colleague Lynn Hasher has done at the University of Toronto. We used to think of working memory as just this holding space. That's crap. Working memory, this is the language she uses, it's a higher order relevance filter. It's basically saying how much processing, let me put that in scare quotes because I share with Anil, I don't like information processing language, but how much has this been processed for relevance? And if you do more processing, it gets in and gets remembered. And if it doesn't, it gets excluded and it doesn't get into working memory and it doesn't go into long-term memory. That's one of many ways.
So primarily it is a function of memory.
It's not, it's a function of memory, but see, memory isn't storage. Memory is also, what you do when you remember is you're constantly making relevant connections. Memory is not about accurately remembering the past, even though we use the word memory. Memory is about trying to intelligently predict the future. So I can do this. I can show you a bunch of patterns of dots, and I'll say, try to remember them. And then what I'll do is I'll show you a picture, and it's not any of those patterns, it's the mathematical average of all of them, right? And I'll show you a bunch of other patterns, and I'll say, which one are you sure you've seen before? And you know which one you'll tell me you're sure you've seen? The mathematical average, even though you did not show it. Because what your memory is doing is it's taking all these things and saying, that. I agree with Anil, predictive process, just published a paper on this in 2022, but predictive processing requires relevance realization, because the more you're trying to predict the future, the more you run into the issue of what should I pay attention to, what's relevant, what matter. This is the fundamental problem in prediction in science. What are the relevant things we're supposed to be predicting?
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with you about the definition of memory, that it is about making connections and it is predictive. It's not a storage house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our memory is nothing like computer memory.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Let's, I just want to get through some
Sorry.
questions.
Okay,
Could
sorry.
Chuck, you were next, I think, with a question.
I think this is a question for Anil. You make in your book, our brain is housed in the skull and has no access to the exterior except through our senses. But it also has access to our interior. Do you think that part of that access is a unique access to thoughts, whatever you want to call them, which results in there being as many realities as there are people, or perhaps as many realities as there are cats and dogs and other conscious beings, so that when we talk about perceiving reality, we really are talking about something that none of us share identically, right? So that there are as many realities as there are conscious entities. And then a follow-up question. It strikes me that hiding behind our talking about consciousness is this sense of whether there's free will or not, and whether we're... is there anything that could ever overcome the possibility that everything is radically deterministic?
Okay, thank you. I'll take that, and then you should
say
your thing.
I'm all right.
Thank you for the question. So this view of the brain as a prediction machine sequestered in this bony vault of the skull, I think, is a very powerful view. It has many antecedents, maybe not Plato, but Kant is kind of the antecedent for me. And it does highlight this tension that although it seems to us our experience of the world has this kind of phenomenal realism, it just seems as though we see things as they really are. The implication is no, that we see things, again, as we are, as constructions. And this phenomenal property that things have, this mind-independent existence, is itself a part of perceptual experience. It's a part of the construction. Doesn't mean that there are an infinite number of objective realities, but I do think it means that every subjective reality is likely to be somewhat different. And the degree of difference will depend on the degree of commonality between the underlying brain mechanisms. So there's this lovely word from Jacob von Uexküll, the ethologist, about the Umwelt. The subjective world of an octopus is going to be very different from the subjective world of a bear or of a mosquito, assuming these things are conscious, which we don't know. Okay? Let's assume. Even within human beings, I think we radically underestimate the degree of what I've been trying to call perceptual diversity. And we underestimate it because, firstly, because things just seem to be as they are. When I look at that, it doesn't seem like it depends on me, so why should anybody else have a different experience looking at the window behind me? Also, the differences are by the nature of conscious experience. They're interior and private, so it's easy to see differences in body shape and skin color and height, but it's much harder to see differences in experiences that are private and subjective, unless they're sufficiently large that they surface in behavior and language. And when they're that large, we tend to slap labels on them, like neurodivergence or something else. And I think that word is useful but also problematic because it ironically reinforces the idea that if you are not neurodivergent, you are neurotypical and see things as they are in the same way that others do. And I think recognizing that we are all different, and maybe not by very much, but nonetheless different, cultivates a useful humility about our own perceptual takes on the world and on the self. And I think that's just a very useful idea for non-scientific reasons, for social and political reasons as well. But I just think it is also true. One of our projects right now is we've been doing this thing called the perception census, which is a very large-scale experiment on 40,000 people, each of them doing several hours of experiments, so by far the largest study of its kind, to try to map out for the first time, really, how individual differences in perception manifest in many different directions, to paint a picture of the rich diversity that we have. So that's one thing. And then the free will thing is a much longer thing, so we won't really touch on that. But frankly, I think this whole idea of whether the universe is stochastic or deterministic is one massive red herring. Mm-hmm. It only matters if the kind of free will you want to preserve is a free will that you shouldn't want to preserve anyway, which is a kind of free will that is a sort of cause that swoops in and makes things happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, that has no prior cause itself. We are complicated creatures with many degrees of freedom, and when we do things that have a causal chain that's relatively internal to us, and our brain perceives that causal chain as being relatively internal to us, that for me is what we perceive as an experience of free will. And for me, that is all that we need to give us the kind of capacity for voluntary, flexible behavior that we colloquially call free will. But free will itself doesn't exist in exactly the same way that redness doesn't exist as objective property of the world. There is something about the world that explains our experience of redness. There is something about what we do that underlies our ability to perform voluntary actions. But we mustn't confuse the content of an experience with the intrinsic structure of the physical universe.
Can I say? Yeah, I just wanted to I wanted to say something about Sophie's question earlier about colleagues disagreeing with me, and I think some people think panpsychism is just a bit weird, but I think that the most common challenge is what Ian referred to in his talk this morning, the combination problem. Okay, you have these little conscious particles. How the hell do they combine to make our consciousness? I'm inclined to think that's really just a problem for a certain kind of panpsychist. It might interest people in this context to know that there's sort of a split in the emerging panpsychist research community, maybe akin to the split in the early psychoanalytic community between followers of Jung and followers of Freud. You know, followers of Jung open to sort of spiritual things like collective unconscious and collective spiritual archetypes and stuff, whereas followers of Freud thinking, no, we need to make this serious science, get rid of all this superstitious nonsense. In the panpsychist research community, there's some panpsychists, maybe David Charms a little bit, Luke Roloffs, who are very reductionist, very secular atheist. You know, there's just conscious particles, we need to tell some reductionist story. And that's where you really get the combination problem. How do you close that expansion gap? Whereas, I guess the side I'm increasingly attracted to is less reductionistic, happy to think, no, there's just new kinds of consciousness emerge and split, and there's new facts evolving in the universe. I mean, very similar to what Ian was articulating this morning. And that problem kind of goes away. Also, there are, panpsychists don't need to think the fundamental conscious things are the particles. Many theoretical physicists are inclined to think actually the fundamental things are universe-wide fields. If you combine that with panpsychism, you get cosmopsychism, that the fundamental thing is the conscious universe. This is something I go into in great detail in my recent book, modestly titled Why the Purpose of the Universe. But just very, very quickly, a quick word on the life stuff. I think that's something actually Anil and I would agree on. The consciousness is more to do with life than information processing. But just, it might be helpful for people like thinking of the disagreements between us three. I think, John's given us a really interesting theory that consciousness is something to do with relevance realization. Anil's got a very interesting view that consciousness is somehow connected to predictive processing. Now, so I don't want to disagree with either of those, both fascinating options. What I would want to claim is, and I think from what John said he might not disagree with this, is that both of these are just neutral on this philosophical question of the mind-body problem, physicalism, panpsychism, dualism. You could accept either of those views and be a physicalist, dualist, panpsychist. So that's and I think ultimately this gets to the point, people don't know what the hell philosophy is. We need to get to a point, I think this is close to what John was saying as well actually, where we understand these different tasks, the philosophical task, the scientific task, the semantic task, are different but closely connected. And, we need to, Anil is on board with this as well. So maybe this isn't a disagreement. But we need to understand these different tasks, how they differ, how they work together, how some are left hemispheric, how some are right hemispheric. And that's really, I think we're not even at first base, really, in getting to that point. Anyway, so that was more long-winded than I intended.
John Boswell said, I think there's a quote from John Boswell, he said, like, I too have tried to be a philosopher, but cheerfulness kept breaking in, which is, I think, my view.
We can be cheerful.
Katie has a question.
Thanks. Sophie, if you describe yourself as a layman, I don't know what that makes me. A pleb, I really, and I'm not terribly well read in this either, but I don't want to be defeatist at this point at the weekend, but, and also I love language, I'm horribly garrulous, and I teach language as well, but could it all be ineffable? And do you ever think I should go off and be a musician or a painter?
Frequently, right? But I think the challenge is to make the ineffable effable.
Yeah, but perhaps that's not possible, or perhaps you will actually get closer to expressing your beliefs about consciousness through music or painting. Do you ever worry about it?
It depends what you were trying to do. I would say if you want to understand consciousness itself, what it's like to be a human being, don't ask a scientist or a philosopher, read some literature, read James Joyce. So that it depends what you're trying to do, whereas I guess what I'm interested in is, okay, how that consciousness connects with our scientific story. That's a different task. And like I was just saying, we need to work out how all these different tasks fit together, plug together into a complete worldview. I think of it all about philosophy as about synthesis, generating or bringing these things together to make a general worldview. Yeah, there's lots of different inputs.
Could I address the ineffability issue? I think I agree with both Anil and Phil on this. I think we have to make a distinction between trying to offer a theoretical explanation of consciousness and trying to train consciousness or trying to transform consciousness or trying to share conscious experiences. I think if you're looking to science or philosophy as the vehicle by which you do those, I think you're fundamentally mistaken. But I think there's a remaining point, which is I think any good account, one of the other implicit assumptions, I don't know if this is actually goes with the four I've mentioned, is we tend to think that our prototypical everyday state of consciousness is that to which we should refer or defer whenever we're trying to explain consciousness. I tend to think that consciousness is properly polyphasic. We should be looking at altered states of consciousness and not as just as deviations from standard consciousness as a way of trying to understand what might be going on in consciousness in a more powerful way. So I think the fact that we have ineffability, the thing about ineffability is it points to not just heights of mystical experience, it points to, Donis does this in her books on the metaphysics, ineffability and its metaphysics. There's many kinds of ineffability. Like you can't really capture in words. Try it sometime. Try to tell somebody how to tie their shoelace. Try it. If you bring up a small child, you know how insane it is. You can't do it. You just have to keep showing them. Ineffability is everywhere. And this points to the fact that we don't just know the world propositionally, we know it through our skills, we know it through states of consciousness, we know it through the identities we take. I talk about non-propositional kinds of knowing. And I think why that matters to me is I think when we get into consciousness, we ultimately will need to invoke non-propositional kinds of knowing. Because I don't think you know consciousness by having beliefs about consciousness. I don't think you know consciousness by having skills. I don't think you have consciousness by taking certain perspectives, although I think consciousness affords that. I think you have consciousness. Consciousness is something you have by being it. It's a knowing by being, by participating. And so if we lock ourselves into propositional knowing, we are hamstringing ourselves with understanding consciousness, because consciousness seems to involve non-propositional knowing. At least I would argue that.
Okay.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. There are two things riding side saddle in my thought right now, and I think they coalesce into a question, so I'm going to attempt to do so. The first is David Hume's famous postulate that you cannot derive an ought from an is. You will never get an ethic from an ontology. We'll put a pin in that. The second thing is the beautiful poem that Elizabeth began the day with, which ended with, indeed we have changed a little, which reminded me of Rilke's imperative to change our lives. And so I think how these are coalescing into a question for me is I'm just wondering how your research has or has not changed your own ethical stance or relationship to your own mind or other minds.
Good question.
I can start. I think it's a great question, actually. It actually speaks to your question about why don't we all just become musicians instead of trying to... and I think part of it is that actually working and thinking about consciousness for this long does change you. It's of course hard to know because I don't have the alternative me who became a musician or worked in a shoe shop. But it seems to me that I live my life differently in virtue of this. It sort of automates some mental reflexes about how to read on the ongoing flow of lived experience. Maybe in a similar way to what meditators also experience after a while, though I would not claim, so I have not put the diligence in, and I'm sure they're different. But there do seem to be some converging patterns. There's a recognition, for me, sort of deeply automated about the self being a process, impermanent, ever-changing, emotions and things being perceptual constructions, not necessarily reflecting things exactly as they are. I think it opens a little bit of a distance between the flow, the immediacy of the flow of experience, and then what happens next. So there is a huge difference. On the ought from is thing, I will remain silent.
Yeah, I happen to think panpsychism is not only the theory that's most likely to be true, but it's also a little bit better for our mental and spiritual health. Especially if you engagement with the environment, and if you think a tree is not just a mechanism but a conscious organism of some very different kind, then a tree has a real moral significance in and of itself. It's not just about what it can do for us. The horrible scenes of burning of forest fires have an extra moral depth if this is the burning of conscious organisms. And I don't know, I find it the way all of us relate to the natural world, I don't know, I do find it hard to make sense of if these are just mechanisms. But and also more with the broader universe, I don't know, it's a universe, panpsychism universe we sort of fit in with a bit more. We're conscious creatures in a conscious universe. The universe filled with consciousness is a bit nicer than a cold, empty space. But that doesn't mean it's true, of course. I always say we should be looking not for the view that we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. Fortunately, panpsychism is more likely to be true, and it's a bit nicer. So you get both.
So I'm going to turn out to be more radical on this, I think, than Phil and Anil. I reject the is-ought distinction. I think Hume is wrong. I think the work of Putnam and Casebeer has demolished that. The is-ought distinction. It presupposes that we have some clean understanding of what a fact is, the fact-value distinction. And there are no facts that are not based on judgments of simplicity, elegance, plausibility, and I'll say it, relevance, right? And those are not, is something being relevant a fact? Well, kinda, because if you don't pay attention to it, you're dead. Is it a value? Well, yeah, because, it might not be relevant to Phil, right? And relevant to, it doesn't cleanly fall into fact or value. Same thing with simplicity, same thing with plausibility, same things with elegance, with reasonableness. And you say, well, blah, 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 blah. And all the attempts to try and get formal computational explanations of these things have collapsed and failed. The analytic-synthetic distinction that Kant used, right, has collapsed under Quine's quit. All of the things that supported the is-ought distinction, the fact-value distinction, have largely collapsed under the knives of analytic philosophy. Not from woo-woo romanticism or anything like that. The analytic philosophers have destroyed all of the basis. For reasons that are unclear, I agree with Putnam, for some reason it's still invoked as if this is a well-established, it's a distinction, as Ian said, but it's a distinction that has become a dualism. In practical cases, you can make distinctions, but we've reified it into an ontological dualism, and that is unjustifiable. I agree with Putnam. I agree with a whole bunch of other people. And what that means for me is that tells us something fundamental about our ontology, about, again, No. If fact and value are interwoven in this way, if all we're ever doing is dealing with relevant facts, and you are, because you don't care about the vast majority of facts. I care about the truth. No, you care about relevant truth. And by the way, you care about truth because you value it, right? I can keep playing this, right? What that means is the idea that, like, I do work on the meaning crisis, the idea that we're somehow radically disconnected from the cosmos is fundamentally wrong at a fundamental ontological level. And that's what I mean. Like, if you're going to actually talk about consciousness, you have to go in and talk about things like the is-ought distinction and why it presupposes, like, and the way Hume justifies it. No philosophers believe Hume's arguments justify the is-ought, because he's presuming, he's presuming an epistemology that everybody. Do you believe that all things, in order to be facts, have to be perceptual? No, of course not. Science doesn't work that way, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, for me, doing work on relevance and connected to consciousness has pushed me, I hope reasonably, rationally, into a complete rejection of the is-ought fact-value dichotomy. There's a distinction. It's pragmatic, it's useful, but there is no ontological dualism there. That's what I would argue.
Ian, you wanted to ask a question, I'm sorry.
Thanks. I'm missing something. I've read a lot about and heard a lot about, predictive processing, and sometimes this is allied to the free energy principle that Carl Friston has made famous. But in a way, for 100 years or more, we've known that perception is not naive. We don't just receive things. We go to meet them with expectations. And obviously, when we're wrong, we change our minds. There's nothing new in this idea. I haven't any way of understanding how this helps us understand consciousness, because predictive processing, free energy principle, reducing the effort, and so on, this could all be done by a non-conscious machine. How does this help at all with consciousness?
It's a very good question. I think for me, it provides the resources to build these explanatory bridges between what might be happening in the brain and phenomenological aspects of what's happening in conscious experience. It's not really the claim that, like, if predictive processing is going on or free energy minimization is going on, then this is conscious and that isn't conscious. Like that, it doesn't give you the answer to that question. So it's unsatisfying in that way, and I concede that. There are people who try to build a claim like that on top, but I'm not convinced by those claims. And you're also right that this whole view is very old, and Hermann von Helmholtz probably the first person to really articulate it as a neuroscientific or psychological theory, perception as unconscious inference. What I think it provides is a set of resources to answer the question, like, how do I map, say, aspects of a visual experience, such as its spatiality, its composition into objects, into figure and ground. The idea that when we see an object, it seems to have a back rather than a front, even though we don't directly see the back. There are things about experiences that we can pay attention to, that we can describe, and we can begin to articulate those properties of phenomenology in terms of properties of kinds of predictions with the mathematical computational language of predictive processing. It's all about the brain encoding probabilistic generative models, things that are able to anticipate incoming sensory data. And these models have different forms, and it turns out these different forms can map onto phenomenology, not just function, in interesting ways. Like hallucination is a great, I think, intuitive example. Chris Frith talked about this long ago, right? When people with psychosis or under psychedelics have visual hallucinations, one intuitively satisfying way to think about that is their brain's predictions are overwhelming the sensory data, so that they lose their grip, they become uncontrolled perceptions, and normal perceptions are kind of controlled hallucination. So we can understand the phenomenology of hallucination richly in this language, the specifics of it. And that, to Philip's point earlier, the idea that physicalism can't explain a singular experience. It can't explain, as yet, it's not a testable thing in itself, but I do think it can explain the phenomenology of specific experiences. And then this traces, for me, a lot of my work has been about emotion and interoception. So an emotion becomes a form of perceptual prediction, but now more to do with what's happening in the body, and the valence quality that emotions have is understandable because now the role of these predictions is to do with control and regulation, not with figuring out what's there. So we begin to sort of dissolve the arbitrariness of what might be happening in the brain and what might be happening in our experience, and ultimately come to this connection with life through something like the free energy principle that you know, ultimately autopoiesis, all of these things can be thought of as a kind of prediction error minimization process.
Okay, so officially I'm only allowed one more question, but 2 people have raised their hands. So Nigel and then Rogan, just ask a quick one. No, just let's
I was just going to make an observation on
it.
ineffability. I love what Frank Ramsey said about Wittgenstein's last line of the Tractatus. You know, the Tractatus famously says, whereof you cannot speak, thereof you must remain silent. Frank Ramsey said, well, if you can't say it, you can't sing it either, or you can't whistle it either. You know, the idea is if you can't say it, there's not an alternative way to express that idea in the same form, for sure. And the idea that if Anil became a musician, somehow he would be able to communicate a theory of consciousness, I think he might be able to communicate all kinds of things, but a theory of consciousness, it wouldn't be.
Thank you. And Rogan, final question. Make it a good one.
We all arrived here expecting and receiving, at least to a degree, a fabulous dust-up between a pragmatic materialist and a panpsychic and a cognitive scientist, Neoplatonist. And we got some wonderful disagreement, but I think as we listened carefully, we found some areas of agreement across the 3 of you, and that feels like a wonderful Kinrossian achievement. Let me offer 4 quickly that I heard. You all seem to at least affirm to varying degrees the Nagel definition of consciousness, which is a nice place to land. There is something it is to be like, what Anil described as perceptual diversity. I love that you all affirm to that. I think, at least I saw nods when Anil said that consciousness is at bottom a property of life. That breathes fire into Phillips via Stephen Hawking's equations. Philip just referred to conscious organisms as in a related way. At least I saw nods of agreement to John's relevance realization. I'm sure there's more to say about it, but this wonderful idea that consciousness might be more adverbial than adjectival. Not the place we all started in our philosophical understandings, I think. And then finally, for all the arrogance you each, I think, tongue-in-cheek, adverted to with book titles and your own perspectives and so on, you all arrive at the place that I think we all share in this room, that the proper approach is humility, or, as Elizabeth concluded her opening remarks this morning, a posture of awed humility. So beginning from 3 very different places and arriving at something like a common understanding we can build on, which really reaches back to both where Simon and Ian began us. What a wonderful achievement. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Nothing needs
well,
to
thank
be added
you.
to
Yeah,
that,
I can't add anything to that.
We still disagree, by the way. Let's not overestimate it. Yeah.
And so not only should you, if you have more questions, obviously go and chat to these people. And Anil's written a great book called Being You, which outlines a lot of some of the stuff he was talking about controlled hallucinations and his approach. And then Philip, you've written 2 about...
Galileo's error, I suppose, is the basic case for panpsychism and how Galileo designed science, which I forgot to talk about, which connected to the first talk this morning. And then I guess why the purpose of the universe is developing that, and maybe connecting it more to spiritual issues and the purpose of existence. And I'll stop.
John, are you...
Greg Enriquez and I are working on a book which should be done by the end of the year, Consciousness and its Transcendent Naturalist Solution.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
Great pleasure, gentlemen.
Excellent.